A morning that turned into chaos. You won't believe what happened next. The city was barely waking up, its streets bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun. Steam curled from manhole covers, the distant hum of traffic beginning to stir. Dwayne Johnson jogged through the quiet streets, his steady breath matching the rhythmic pounding of his sneakers against the pavement. It was supposed to be just another ordinary morning, a quick run, a stop for coffee, and maybe a peaceful moment before the day truly began. But peace doesn't last long in a city like this. Inside a small cafe on the corner, the air was warm with the scent of fresh espresso and pastries. The morning crowd was sparse, a couple whispering by the window, an elderly man flipping through a newspaper, and a young girl, no older than 11, scribbling into a notebook at the counter. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, the kind of place where trouble should never find its way in. And then the door slammed open. 5 men stepped inside, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Leather jackets, heavy boots, tattoos winding up their arms like battle scars. They weren't here for coffee. They were here to make sure everyone in that cafe knew exactly who held the power in this city. Their leader, a hulking brute with a cocky grin, scanned the room until his gaze landed on Dwayne Johnson, a man they assumed was just another face, just another customer looking for a quiet morning. Big mistake. Within seconds, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The men sneered, taunted, pushed their weight around. Their voices grew louder, their threats more obvious. A cup was knocked over, spilling coffee across the counter. A young girl gasped, her notebook ruined by the spreading stain. The room went silent. People shrank in their seats, eyes darting toward Dwayne, the only one who hadn't moved. And then he stood up. No words, no theatrics, just a slow, deliberate movement. His towering frame seemed to fill the room, his gaze locking onto the men like a predator assessing its prey. The leader smirked, cracking his knuckles, ready to make an example out of the so-called action star. He thought it would be easy, a quick scuffle, a show of force. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. A lightning-fast dodge, a fist meeting nothing but air. A single controlled strike sending a man sprawling across the cafe floor. Chaos erupted, tables overturned, chairs skidded, and the world suddenly realized that Dwayne Johnson was not a man to be messed with. What happened next? Who walked away? Who didn't? And why would this be a morning no one in that cafe would ever forget? Find out in the full story now. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another action-packed moment. Dawn in Halcyon City came softly, painting the skyscrapers with pale streaks of orange and pink. The streets were drowsy. Store owners hadn't lifted their shutters yet, and most citizens were still tucked in bed, waiting for alarm clocks to jolt them into a new day. Dwayne Johnson laced up his running shoes, stepping onto the sidewalk that glistened faintly from a light rain overnight. The hush of early morning beckoned him, an unspoken promise of solitude before the city's frantic pulse awakened. This run was a daily ritual, a chance to find mental clarity in a world that rarely granted it. A few vendors were already setting up, a florist unloading crates of daisies and roses, a produce seller arranging bundles of leafy greens under a small awning. Dwayne jogged past them, offering polite nods. His breath came in steady intervals, the rhythmic pounding of his sneakers echoing across empty intersections. Years of physical training had refined his body into a near-perfect instrument, capable not only of raw power, but of measured control too. He moved with an unhurried grace, as though each step were pre-planned and purposeful. While the rest of the world recognized him as a prominent action star here on the still sleeping streets, he felt like a regular man savoring a private pocket of calm. The chilly air bit at his lungs, yet it invigorated him, pushing him to maintain a brisk tempo. He didn't run to chase records. It was a discipline he cherished, a moment of reflection that kept him centered before a day full of demands. He relished the anonymity the early hour afforded, though he knew that anonymity was fragile. A single glance from a curious passerby could break the spell and turn his morning jog into a minor public spectacle. But for now, no one recognized him under his cap and hoodie. About half an hour into his run, Dwayne decelerated near a part of the city he seldom explored, a quiet district with vintage brick buildings, their facades adorned with painted murals that spoke of a more artisanal era. As his breathing slowed, a warm aroma of coffee drifted to him from a corner cafe. He glanced up at the sign, Clara's Cup and Roast, a modest, homey place with large windows inviting in the faint sunlight. The idea of a hot black coffee to wrap up his jog felt irresistible. He approached, intrigued by the cozy interior lighting and the subdued hush inside. Slipping through the glass door, Dwayne noted only a handful of patrons scattered around the cafe. A young couple murmured sweet nothings at a table by the window. An elderly gentleman sipped tea while reading the morning paper. And near the counter, an 11-year-old girl in a neatly pressed uniform was hunched over a notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. Probably finishing homework or scribbling last-minute notes before school. The rest of the cafe had that intangible hush that belongs to early morning. Soft chatter, clinks of ceramic cups, the gentle hum of the espresso machine. Perfect for a moment of stillness. Dwayne approached the counter, placed an order for a plain black coffee, and waited while Evelyn, the cafe manager, prepared it. No one paid special attention to him, just another customer in athletic gear, likely finishing an early workout. And that suited Dwayne perfectly. He found a small table at the back, taking out his phone to browse messages, letting the subdued ambiance wash over him. For a brief span, it was exactly what he craved. Peaceful, uneventful. A respite from the world's scrutiny. But fate had other plans. As he scrolled through a few news updates, Dwayne felt a flicker of awareness. Someone was looking at him. Glancing up, he spotted the young girl near the counter, sneaking glances in his direction. Catching his eye, she reddened and buried her face in her notebook, as though mortified at being noticed. With a slight grin, Dwayne returned to his phone, amused by her shy curiosity. He'd encountered fans of all ages, but children often had the most genuine reactions. A few minutes later, she mustered enough courage to approach, her notebook clutched against her chest, steps hesitant on the tile floor. She stopped a couple of feet away, voice quivering with both excitement and nerves. Excuse me," she stammered. Are you Dwayne Johnson?" Dwayne could see the mixture of hope and uncertainty in her eyes. The coffee aroma drifted between them, mingling with the hush of subdued conversations. He gently tilted his cap, letting her see his face more clearly. He hesitated, then gave a playful half-smile. "I'm just here for a coffee," he replied, feigning oblivion to his own celebrity. The girl giggled, unsure whether to believe him. With an audible swallow, she pressed on, "If you are him, could I please have your autograph?" She offered a battered notebook, its pages already filled with doodles and scribbles. Dwayne recognized childlike sketches of scenes from movies she must have watched. Glancing around the cafe, he noticed no one else was paying much attention to their exchange. All eyes were on phones, papers, or a quiet conversation. The little girl's quiet bravery touched him. "All right," he said softly, taking the notebook. He scrawled an autograph on a blank page, adding a short note. "To the bravest one in the room, keep chasing your dreams." Her face lit up with joy that couldn't be faked. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," she breathed. "Could we? Maybe a picture if it's not too much trouble?" He paused for a moment. The last thing he wanted was to invite a crowd. But a single snapshot wouldn't ruin the morning, he figured. "Sure, just one," he agreed, waiting while she whipped out her phone. They snapped a quick photo, her grin so wide it was as though she'd just met a real-life superhero. With a whispered, "Thank you," she hurried back to her seat, burying her nose in the autograph like it was her most treasured possession. Dwayne resumed sipping his coffee, that small encounter brightening his morning. He would have been content for the day to continue in that soft, pleasant hum. However, an abrupt shift hit the cafe like a gust of wind rattling a calm pond. The door banged open with a clang, letting in a gust of chilly morning air. Curtis, a hulking, rough-edged man, stepped inside, flanked by four of his friends. They wore leather jackets loaded with menacing patches, the type you might associate with rowdy biker clubs. Their boots clomped aggressively on the tile, fists half-clenched as though itching to intimidate. Evelyn paused mid-step behind the counter, unsettled by the group's arrival. Dwayne's alert senses honed in on them. He recognized that posture, chins raised defiantly, eyes scanning for a potential target. The atmosphere in the cafe had changed from mild tranquility to an uneasy hush. The young girl froze in her seat, her wide eyes trembling as she clutched the newly signed notebook. Dwayne remained calm, observing them through the reflection in the window, suspecting that trouble had just waltzed in. Curtis pointed a meaty finger across the cafe. "Look who we got here, fellas," he sneered in a voice that seemed to demand an audience. "The big action star. Thinks he's unstoppable." His gaze landed on Dwayne with a smug grin, as if thrilled to have found a new plaything. The rest of his crew, each sporting a unique brand of roughness, scarred faces, battered boots, let out short bursts of laughter. It was a contrived, bullying sort of laughter that aimed to fill the space with tension. Dwayne set his coffee cup down, inhaling slowly. This wasn't his first tango with bullies who craved a spectacle. Typically, a few calm words might diffuse the situation. He didn't want a full-blown confrontation in front of an innocent child who just mustered the courage to ask for an autograph. Silently, he stood, turning to face them. The hush grew more pronounced, the cafe patrons shrinking into corners to avoid involvement. Even the young couple by the window flinched, whispering anxiously. Curtis's lips curled in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Not so tough off the screen, huh?" he taunted. "Bet you rely on fancy camera tricks to look strong." Dwayne's expression remained neutral. "I'm just here to enjoy a coffee," he replied. "No need for trouble." But as soon as he finished, another of the bikers, a shorter, wiry fellow with a jagged scar across his cheek, stepped up, grabbing a sugar dispenser from a nearby table and flipping it in his hand like a potential missile. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn, trembling behind the counter, shot anxious glances at the door, perhaps debating if she should call the police. Damon, a soft-spoken patron at another table, looked ready to leap under the furniture. Meanwhile, the 11-year-old girl, who had been brimming with joy mere moments before, now gripped her soggy uniform and drenched notebook, perched on the edge of her seat in alarm. She cast a pleading look at Dwayne, silently hoping he'd intervene to keep the peace. Curtis gave a bark of laughter, hooking his thumbs under his jacket's lapels. "Trouble? Nah," he said, voice dripping with mock sweetness. "We just want to see if Mr. Muscles over here is as tough as the movies make him out to be." The wiry one with the sugar dispenser twirled it again, smirking as though each rotation fueled his ego. Another broader biker, face half hidden by a shaggy beard, muttered something inaudible but threatening under his breath. Dwayne kept his stance relaxed, arms at his sides, not raising fists or posturing. He understood bullies thrived on escalation, and giving them a calm front was often the first step to deflating their theatrics. "Look," he began quietly, "no one needs to get hurt. Why not just sit, have a coffee, and leave everyone else alone?" A snort erupted from a tall, pale biker, wearing tinted shades. "Thinks he's our teacher now, giving us orders," he rasped. Another wave of hoarse laughter washed over the group. The child in the corner flinched. It was clear she was struggling to keep tears at bay, her precious autograph now tarnished. Noting her distress, Dwayne felt a twinge of protective resolve. Children should never have to witness scenes like this, but bullies seldom cared about the collateral harm they caused. Curtis shrugged, glancing at his companions. "Coffee's not what we're after, big guy. More like entertainment. Let's see some of that fancy fighting you do on screen." "Show us a real fight." The last word rolled off his tongue like a challenge etched in venom. The hush grew sharper, the tension so thick that even the faint hum of the espresso machine seemed to fade. Dwayne's eyes flicked to the child's table, and in that brief second, the wiry biker launched the sugar dispenser at him, hurling it overhand in a blur of metal and sugar. Dwayne stepped to the side with reflexes honed by years of training, the dispenser whistling past and shattering a salt shaker on the next table. Customers gasped, leaning away as shards of glass and sugar crystals scattered across the floor. A rancid kind of glee flashed across the bikers' faces. They'd escalated things, and no one had stepped in to stop them. Grinding his teeth, Dwayne recognized there was no talking them down now. They wanted a show, and they wouldn't relent until they got one. He inhaled deeply, gaze flicking around to plan for minimal damage. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked in a measured tone. But the glint in Curtis's eyes said it all. This was exactly what they wanted. Without waiting for an answer, Curtis reached for a nearby table, flipping it violently to clear space. Cups and saucers clattered to the floor in a cacophony of porcelain shards. A few customers yelped, scurrying to the walls or ducking behind counters. The young girl stifled a cry of alarm, pressing her back to the cafe's corner as tears welled up at the corners of her eyes. Dwayne's jaw tightened. The bullies were feeding off the fear in the room. "Don't say we didn't warn you," Curtis declared smugly, rolling his neck as though preparing for a brawl. Another biker, short and wiry with a spidery tattoo on his left forearm, nudged Damon's table aside, the scraping legs producing a grating squeal. Damon shot to his feet, face pale, stumbling backward to join the other petrified onlookers. Evelyn, trembling behind the register, looked like she wanted to intervene but couldn't muster the courage. She reached for her phone, presumably to dial emergency services, but the phone slipped from her sweaty grip. One of the bikers noticed, bellowing, "Not a good idea, lady," sending her into a frightened recoil. Fear pinned the entire cafe in place, except Dwayne, who took a half step forward. His stance still wasn't combative. No fists raised, no wide stance, but it radiated confidence. "Last chance to back down," he said, voice steady. "Don't ruin your morning over this." His eyes flicked from the short, wiry one to the bearded bruiser, then to the tinted shades fellow. But any flicker of second-guessing was drowned out by the echo of macho laughter. Curtis, evidently the ringleader, gave a mocking snort. "You talk a lot for a guy about to get flattened." Dwayne exhaled, readying himself mentally. He didn't want an all-out brawl, not in front of bystanders, especially not in front of a child. But if the bikers insisted, he'd do what needed to be done as cleanly as possible. He shifted his posture fractionally, distributing his weight for swift movement. The hush that fell now was so thick that the hum of the lights overhead sounded deafening. The child, hugging her battered notebook, watched with a mixture of terror and faint hope in her eyes. Curtis lunged first, telegraphing his move with a wide swing aimed at Dwayne's ribcage. Swiftly, Dwayne sidestepped, hooking Curtis's forearm mid-swing and using the man's momentum against him. In a fluid motion, Dwayne locked Curtis's wrist, twisting just enough to force a pain grimace. With the same motion, he swept Curtis's legs, sending him sprawling onto a table which collapsed under his weight. The entire cafe gasped, the breath of watchers collectively drawn in shock. Before Curtis's stunned companions could react, Dwayne was already pivoting. The short, wiry biker with the spidery tattoo tried to rush him from behind. Dwayne stepped aside again, letting the smaller man's forward motion carry him into a harmless tumble. The second biker crashed into the back of a chair, toppling it with a clang. Dwayne halted, giving them a final chance to yield without further violence, but the bearded bruiser advanced next, fist cocked. He threw a heavy right hook, but Dwayne ducked seamlessly. With a controlled elbow strike, Dwayne caught the biker in the gut, forcing him to stagger backward. Another quick sweep, and the big man lost his footing, crashing among the shattered remains of tables. The hush thickened, dread and awe swirling in the onlookers. The child clutched her notebook so tightly her knuckles whitened. For a fleeting second, it looked as though the confrontation might end swiftly. Yet the tinted shades biker whipped out a short metal pipe from his jacket, brandishing it menacingly. "This is your big moment, right?" The tinted shades biker spat, swinging the pipe in a slow arc to taunt Dwayne. The battered forms of his companions sprawled around him, but his arrogance remained. Dwayne set his jaw, heart steady, scanning the man's posture for telegraphed moves. Glancing across the cafe, he saw the child's eyes fixed on him. This had to end before anyone else got hurt, or traumatized further. The pipe came at him in a swift, diagonal slash. Dwayne parried by seizing the biker's wrist, controlling the direction of the blow with the minimal force needed. Pivoting gracefully, he twisted the man's arm behind his back. The pipe slipped from the biker's grip, rattling to the floor. A short, precise strike with Dwayne's forearm sent the tinted shades biker crumpling to his knees. With a stifled groan, the biker realized he was pinned, his face contorted in pain. Suddenly, a sharp cry from behind him made Dwayne spin around. The wiry biker had snatched the child's ruined notebook from her hands, brandishing it mockingly. "What's this? Your hero's autograph?" he sneered, flipping the soggy pages. The girl gasped, tears edging her eyes. Dwayne's blood roiled. Stripping away a child's hope was a cruelty that exceeded mere fists or aggression. In a breath, Dwayne closed the gap. He wrenched the notebook free from the man's grip with one hand and delivered a punishing elbow into the wiry biker's midsection with the other. The man doubled over, a ragged wheeze forced from his lungs. Dwayne caught him by the collar, guiding him to the floor in a slow, controlled motion, enough to subdue him without smashing the cafe into further disarray. He then handed the notebook back to the child, gently enough to reassure her. She clutched it to her chest, tears shining in gratitude and relief. Curtis, who had regained his footing, tried one last assault. Fueled by humiliation, he roared and charged. His punch soared wide as Dwayne sidestepped once more, hooking Curtis's arm and using his forward momentum to slam him onto a vacant table. The table groaned under the impact, toppling as Curtis's mass crashed into it. This time, the fight drained out of Curtis, replaced by a pained grunt and a look of stunned disbelief. He lay gasping among smashed ceramic shards, his tough guy persona thoroughly dismantled. Panting and battered, the group of bikers found themselves scattered around the cafe, each one incapacitated by a measured strike or a well-timed shift of balance. Dwayne, chest heaving only slightly from exertion, scanned for any further threats. The hush that descended was staggering, as though the entire cafe was suspended in awe. At last, clarity returned. The bikers were no longer threats, moaning on the ground or slumped against broken furniture. The child stared at Dwayne, notebook clutched tight, her earlier tears replaced by wide-eyed wonder. As the tension dissipated, onlookers exhaled. Some patted their own faces in a sort of relief, while others stared at the devastation. The manager, Evelyn, overcame her shock enough to fish out her phone, presumably to call the police. One or two customers retrieved scattered chairs, rearranging them to give space to the battered men who might need medical attention. The child gingerly set her notebook on a nearby table, watching Dwayne as if he'd just performed a magic trick. Indeed, for those who had never seen real skill in action, it felt like that. A carefully choreographed display of discipline, power, and refusal to let cruelty run rampant. Police sirens wailed in the distance, a clarion call growing louder by the second. Dwayne knew that explaining the destroyed tables and battered bikers to the authorities would be a necessary but cumbersome step. The battered men themselves, groaning and cursing softly, had no illusions left about avenging their humiliation. They were beaten, figuratively and literally, by a man who barely seemed winded. One of them, likely in shock, half lay on the tile floor, breathing raggedly. Curtis tried to pick himself up, only to collapse back onto the wreckage of the table with a pain growl. You'll pay for this," he managed through clenched teeth. Dwayne just glanced down, calm as ever, retorting in a near murmur. "I don't think so." The hush in the cafe remained, but it was no longer born of fear, rather of awe and relief. Evelyn, her phone pressed to her ear, stepped around fragments of ceramic to take stock of the damage. No doubt she was telling emergency dispatch about a brawl involving Dwayne Johnson and a group of thugs. The day's quiet calm had ended in a swirl of chaos, yet, unbelievably, no innocent customer had suffered serious harm. A couple of minutes later, the door swung open again, this time revealing uniformed officers with drawn expressions. They entered with caution, scanning the scene. On seeing the battered men and the iconic figure standing over them, the lead officer, Officer Delgado, exhaled in exasperated surprise. He recognized Dwayne at once, his celebrity status impossible to miss, even though Dwayne had tried to maintain a low profile. Glancing at the strewn chairs, spilled coffee, and shattered tables, Delgado's eyebrows knitted together. "What happened here?" Evelyn rushed up, phone still in hand, blurting, "They came in harassing us, trying to start a fight. Dwayne just defended everyone." She sounded both apologetic for the mess and incredibly grateful. The policeman's gaze flicked to the child, who still clutched her notebook with trembling fingers. Then to the men groaning on the floor. Curtis spat a curse under his breath, but the policeman ignored him for the moment, focusing on Dwayne for an explanation. Dwayne, arms relaxed at his sides, answered evenly. They came looking for trouble. I asked them to back off. They insisted on a fight. I did what I had to do. His calm tone, coupled with the entire cafe's nods of confirmation, left little room for doubt. Delgado then motioned for his partner to examine the bikers, possibly needing an ambulance for some of them. Another officer began taking statements from the customers. The child piped up, voice quivering. He saved me, she said, hugging her precious notebook. They spilled coffee on me and tore my pages, but he fought them away. Delgado's stern expression softened. All right, everyone remain calm. We'll handle it from here. Approaching the battered bikers, Delgado watched them with a mixture of professional detachment and pity. It was plain to see they had orchestrated their own downfall. The short, wiry man with the chain lay moaning about broken ribs. The bearded bruiser spat out a protest of innocence no one believed. Tinted shades man sat propped against an upturned chair, coughed up a mouthful of curses. The policeman simply gave them a withering look. Turning back to Dwayne, Delgado asked, "Do you want to press charges?" Dwayne's gaze swept over the battered men, a flicker of regret crossing his features at the needless violence. No, he said at last. They've had enough. Delgado nodded, appearing both relieved and impressed. All right, we'll take them in for questioning. These guys look like they have a history. Within minutes, more squad cars arrived, swirling red and blue lights flickering through the cafe's windows. Officers stepped inside, collecting the battered bikers with methodical efficiency. Curtis, scowling behind a bruise-darkening cheek, shot Dwayne a last glare. But battered pride left him incapable of a final confrontation. Instead, he let the officers haul him up by his arms and half-drag him out. His friends, equally bruised and whimpering, trudged after him. A hush of relief settled in the cafe as the door slammed shut behind them. Evelyn surveyed the carnage. Tables cracked, coffee soaked into the tile, chairs flipped. She let out a shaken exhale, running a hand through disheveled hair. I don't know how to thank you, she murmured to Dwayne, voice trembling with residual shock. This could have ended so much worse. Dwayne gave a small shrug, retrieving a discarded towel from behind the counter to wipe coffee splatters from his jacket. I just did what needed doing. Patrons timidly emerged from behind counters or chairs, the tension in their posture receding. Damon, who had cowered near the corner, approached Dwayne, gratitude etched in every line of his face. I've never seen anything like that, he admitted softly. You handled them so efficiently. His eyes flicked to the child, who was still hugging her notebook. And you saved her from who knows what. Dwayne offered a mild, lopsided smile. No one got hurt. That's what matters. Besides, she saved herself by speaking up, didn't she? The child, hearing that, managed a grin that transformed her entire expression. She gently opened her coffee-stained notebook, flipping past scribbled notes until she reached the page where Dwayne had written his short autograph and encouragement. Though partially smudged, it remained legible enough to remind her of the morning's lesson in courage. Clara, a barista who'd watched the entire conflict in terrified silence, finally exhaled a shaky breath. She stepped forward, bowing her head in thanks. Sir, if you ever want coffee, it's on the house, she said, her voice wavering between relief and awe. Dwayne waved off the offer, though he appreciated the gesture. I might hold you to that, he joked lightly, his humor soothing the lingering tension in the air. Meanwhile, outside, the police loaded the bikers into separate cruisers. The morning sun had fully risen, bathing the street in bright gold. Curious bystanders peered from across the way, some snapping pictures with phones. The hush inside the cafe persisted, as though they needed time to absorb the reality that everything was over. The child let her shoulders slump, finally allowing tears of relief to slip down her cheeks. Dwayne crouched gently. You all right? He asked, a gentle paternal note in his voice. She sniffed, nodding. Yes, thank you. Carefully, she set her battered notebook on the table, smoothing out the sticky pages. I never saw anything like that, she said, her voice quivering with residual adrenaline. You just, you made it look so easy. Dwayne's lips curled into a soft, reassuring smile. It's not about easy. It's about training and using only what's necessary. He looked at the cafe's mess, shattered crockery, spilled coffee, toppled furniture. I'm sorry for the damage, though. Evelyn managed a tearful laugh, still clearly rattled. This is nothing compared to what might have happened. A short while later, the police re-entered to confirm details, wrapping up statements from the cafe's patrons. Officer Delgado approached Dwayne with a small grin and a notepad in hand. We have enough witness accounts to confirm what happened, he said. You mind giving your statement on record? Dwayne nodded, following Delgado to a quiet corner. The officer flicked through pages of scribbled notes. So these guys came in, threatened people, and then physically attacked you, correct? More or less, Dwayne responded evenly. I tried to talk them down. They insisted. Delgado jotted a few lines. Happens all too often. He paused, leveling Dwayne a studying look. And you're not pressing charges? Dwayne shook his head. They've learned a lesson. Delgado raised an eyebrow, scribbling further. Well, we've got them in custody for assault. Possibly more, considering they showed up with the intent to cause trouble. Don't be surprised if you're called in as a witness. Dwayne inclined his head in acceptance. Understood. Meanwhile, watchers still lingered. A middle-aged man in a suit quietly snapped a photo of the scene, presumably to share with coworkers. Damon, leaning near the door, attempted to calm his shaky nerves, stepping aside each time an officer passed. The child rummaged her bag for tissues, dabbing at the sticky blotches on her uniform. Her once stained pages, though partially smeared, now served as a cherished token of resilience. Evelyn and Clara orchestrated a mini cleanup. Wielding brooms and mops, they gingerly cleared the worst of the coffee puddles and ceramic shards. A few good Samaritans from the crowd joined in, setting chairs upright, tossing away broken debris. Dwayne pitched in where he could, picking up larger fragments of porcelain. It seemed trivial. He was the star who subdued the bullies, yet it also felt natural. Like everyone else, he sought to restore normalcy. At last, Delgado gave a nod of finality. We'll be in touch if we need more from you. Meanwhile, try to stay out of fights. A faint smile hinted that he recognized how improbable that might be. Dwayne had no illusions either. Bullies rarely forgot humiliations. I'll do my best, he answered. Delgado exchanged a quick handshake with him, then stepped out to finalize loading the bikers into vehicles, the shriek of sirens receding as the police caravanned away. The hush that followed felt surreal, as though the cafe was forcibly returning to the everyday. The battered furniture, wet floors, and scattered dish shards attested to the morning's chaos, but the tension had evaporated. People began picking up their half-finished drinks, meandering back to what passed for normal. Damon exhaled, turning to Dwayne. I've never seen anything like that. Like what you did. You didn't even look angry. Dwayne offered a slight shrug. Anger clouds judgment. If you stay calm, you control the situation. The younger man nodded, absorbing that. The child approached again, her voice hushed. Was that? In your movies, you make it look so big and loud. This was smaller, but scary. Dwayne's smile was gentle. Real fights usually are smaller, more raw, and if you do them right, they end quickly. She looked at her battered notebook, sighing. Guess I'll need a new one. But she flipped to the page he had autographed. Though stained, it remained legible. A triumphant grin crept over her face. I'll keep this anyway. He patted the top of her notebook with a fatherly touch. You keep that. Always remember how you stood up. Maybe next time, you'll do it even stronger. Then, with the cafe's hustle returning, Dwayne realized he too should leave. He'd done enough for one morning. The city demanded the rest of his day. But first, he spied Evelyn behind the counter, rummaging for something in a storeroom. Approaching her, he quietly asked if she was okay. She stared up, fatigue shading her eyes, but also an undercurrent of gratitude. Better than I'd be if you weren't here, she admitted. I've never seen them that vicious. Usually bullies come in, but leave after some idle threats. These guys, they wanted a show. Dwayne nodded. They got one. He scanned the battered interior. I'm sorry about all the damage. Evelyn waved off his apology, dropping a handful of fresh napkins onto a tray. Not your fault. Nothing we can't fix. We're just glad you stepped in. She mustered a shaky laugh. Otherwise, who knows how it might have ended? She insisted on refunding his coffee, which he politely refused. Really, it's fine, Dwayne said. But she stood firm, pressing a free drink coupon into his hand. Least I can do, she said with finality. Realizing she wouldn't budge, he gave a quiet chuckle, slipping it into his pocket. All right, if it makes you feel better, I'll come back, maybe under calmer circumstances. Clara joined them, carrying a dustpan of broken shards. She looked at Dwayne with a mixture of relief and lingering awe. I might post a sign, no bullies allowed, Dwayne Johnson might be watching, she joked. It felt good to see humor creeping back into a place that, minutes ago, was racked by fear. Dwayne recognized that humor was a crucial way to process trauma, so he let the corners of his mouth tug up in a conspiratorial grin. Might keep them away. With that, he carefully weaved around the wreckage, giving a final glance toward the child. She offered him a small wave, accompanied by a timid smile. The memory of her courage overshadowed the violence. No doubt she'd carry this morning's events, both the terror and the lesson, for a long time. He gave her a short salute of recognition, then slipped out the door into a city that had fully woken, none the wiser to the drama inside. The sunlight now bathed the buildings in a crisp brilliance, and traffic had thickened. Commuters rushed to catch buses or slip into cabs, phone calls cradled to their ears. The city breathed with purpose. Dwayne inhaled, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. For a moment, he considered heading straight home for a shower, then on to the day's obligations, interviews, possible script readings, but an old familiar sense of unease burrowed into his gut. The bikers had parted with sneers and half-uttered threats. Men like that seldom let humiliation lie quietly. He suspected they might try again. Sure enough, as he strolled down a side street lined with shuttered storefronts, a prickle of awareness flickered at the base of his neck. He caught subtle shapes in reflective surfaces. A silhouette in a parked car mirror, the faint hum of motorcycle engines echoing over the normal city clamor. They were out there somewhere. Perhaps not all of them had been carted away by the cops. Or maybe they had backups, others in the same group, disgruntled by the story they'd heard, that their buddies got hammered by one man. Dwayne remained outwardly calm, continuing a measured pace that looked casual to passersby. He had no desire to upend the city with another brawl. But if the bullies pressed, he'd handle it with the same measured approach. Distaste for senseless violence had never stopped him from responding decisively when needed. As he turned a corner, the sense of being followed intensified, spurring a memory of many film scenes he'd shot. Except this was no choreographed set. This was reality, where injuries couldn't be undone with retakes. He decided on a route that branched into a smaller street, a narrower corridor that offered fewer escape routes, but also fewer chances for bystanders to get hurt if a fight broke out. The steps behind him grew more brazen, echoing faintly off brick walls. Eventually, Dwayne paused, turning slowly. There they were, two from the cafe, apparently not as incapacitated as they'd let on, accompanied by a newly arrived third, presumably from the same biker gang. They fanned out with swagger, blocking the street's end. One revved a beat-up motorcycle, letting it idle menacingly. Dwayne inhaled, a calm acceptance settling over him. You again, he said, voice steady. The tall one, sporting a fresh bruise on his temple, sneered. We don't let people embarrass us like that and walk away. Time for payback. His eyes flickered with a mixture of bravado and leftover pain, as if his battered body was cursing him for a second attempt. Dwayne set his stance, scanning the alley for potential hazards. No onlookers or cameras to hamper his freedom of movement, but also no help should the bikers produce more serious weapons. You should have learned, he replied, his tone edged with finality. Want another beating? The man on the motorcycle revved harder, roaring the engine in a savage note that ricocheted between the tight walls. You think you're unstoppable, huh? A bearded accomplice spat. Without the cops or fans to watch, let's see how tough you are. The tension soared, crackling in the confined space. Dwayne recognized that these men felt cornered by their own pride, seeking to reclaim whatever shredded respect they'd lost. They'd do anything to preserve their sense of identity. He gave them one final chance. Walk away. Last warning. You lost once. Don't force it again. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the battered tall man barked a curse and lunged. Dwayne pivoted, catching the man's fist mid-swing, twisting gently but firmly. The biker groaned in surprise as Dwayne used minimal force to redirect his momentum, flipping him to the pavement with a controlled throw. Another from behind raised a length of chain overhead. Dwayne sensed it, releasing the first man to duck under the chain's arc. He sprang up, delivering a short, precise blow to the chain wielder's ribs, pushing him into an awkward fall. Meanwhile, the man on the motorcycle revved again, steering the bike in a brazen attempt to mow Dwayne down. The roar of the engine thundered in the narrow passage. Dwayne sidestepped at the last moment, hooking the handlebar just enough to knock the rider off balance. The front wheel swerved, scraping the brick wall. The biker tumbled sideways with a yelp, crashing onto the hard asphalt. Dwayne exhaled, heart pounding in focus. This was a risk-laden scenario, but he had managed it with minimal damage. Again, the bikers moaned, pride further shredded, bodies battered anew. The last upright man, the bearded one, grit his teeth, rummaging for a knife. You, he began, voice trembling with frustration. He lunged, blade glinting. Once more, Dwayne's reflexes proved sharper. He deflected the slash with an outward block, then hammered a low kick into the man's thigh. The knife clattered to the ground. A follow-up strike to the torso folded him in half, sending him sprawling. Gasping curses echoed in the stillness, but none of them had the strength to stand. Breath returning to normal, Dwayne surveyed the aftermath. Just as at the cafe, the bikers lay scattered in painful submission. He retrieved the fallen chain and tossed it aside so it wouldn't be used again. The second wave had ended even swifter than the first. He shook his head at their stubbornness. If they continued like this, they might end up in a hospital or worse. But there was no sense in lecturing them. They wouldn't listen. Instead, he simply told them, "Next time you might not be so lucky," turning on his heel to exit. He doubted they'd push for a third round, at least not today. Sirens wailed in the distance once more, a chorus of city life that refused to be quiet for long. The men on the pavement groaned, cursing him in breathless rage, but Dwayne had nothing more to prove. He stepped back into the open street, returning to the city's hustle. This time, no spectators lined the sidewalk with cameras, only office workers in a hurry and vendors hawking morning goods. Another day in Halcyon City, another confrontation behind him. He checked his phone again, seeing more reminders for his schedule. Life marched on. The 11-year-old child in the cafe, the battered men behind him, the hush of onlookers. These memories wove together in his mind. He couldn't rescue everyone from every bully in the world. But for that morning, he'd reminded a handful of troublemakers that cruelty had consequences, and that sometimes quiet strength steps in to show them the truth. He walked on, the city's swirl enveloping him, mind already shifting to the next duty. But part of him clung to the satisfaction that a simple morning run had blossomed into an affirmation of what he believed in. Real strength isn't about dominating others, it's about defending the vulnerable. That single lesson was worth more than any big screen fight scene, if only bullies learned it too. With a final glance over his shoulder, ensuring no shadowy figures trailed him, Dwayne Johnson slipped into the city's throng, heart calm and steps sure, knowing his day had already made a difference.